Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first episode of the Crash F1 podcast for the 2025 Formula One season. My name is Jack, and I'm joined by Crash F1's editorial team, Lewis Larkam and Connor McDonagh. Good morning, guys.
Morning.
So we're over the hump of pre-season now, and we're approaching the part of the year where the press rumour mill kicks back into gear and we start to look towards the season ahead. But before we get into all our F1 chat for this episode, I think we should introduce who we are and what we do for a living. So, guys, what do you do on the website? And, what are your positions?
So I'm Lewis. I'm the F1 editor at Crash. Responsible for covering news, writing features, analysis, reports, all that kind of stuff. Been doing this for 7 years at Crash now.
Yeah, so I'm Connor. I'm an F1 journalist for Crash. I've been here since 2020 as a freelancer, then as a content exec from 2021. So, yeah, similar to Lewis, really. A lot of news writing, live blogging, and all that good stuff, really. So, yeah, really enjoyable job, and, very privileged to be in this position.
Yeah, for sure. It's awesome to be a part of the sport, and I think everyone is looking forward after a kind of unexpectedly great year last year. All the hopes are on 2025 to match it and even beat it. And, of course, the main headline as we head into the year, as it was, of course, throughout all of last year, is Lewis Hamilton's move from Brackley, the Mercedes team, to Maranello, and his new red overalls at Ferrari. Enzo Ferrari famously, one of the most popular Drive to Survive type quotes, but he said, if you ask a child to draw a car, and he will certainly colour it red. How are you guys covering the Lewis Hamilton to Ferrari move, and kind of what are your general thoughts on the biggest transfer we've seen in Formula One in a long time?
Yeah, like you said, it arguably is the biggest F1 transfer of all time, biggest driver move, and it's been a hugely hyped since the start of last year. Like you said, it was announced in February 2024, so it's been a story that's just run and run for us. It's been a big talking point for our coverage and for everyone in the paddock. It's sort of dominated a lot of the agenda, and I think quite a lot of people were, particularly at the start of last season, when it looked as if we were going to get another season of potential Red Bull dominance and Verstappen winning the title and wrapping that up quite early. I think a lot of people's focus was already sort of shifting towards 2025 and this big move for Hamilton and Ferrari. Obviously, as the season developed, we ended up having a pretty exciting title fight in the end, and the attention shifted back to on-track stuff. But this has always been sort of simmering away in the background, and as last year sort of developed, it was interesting to see how that all played out, and Lewis's relationship at Mercedes, his performance on track, and then obviously starting to think about 2025 and how he will fare at Ferrari.
Yeah, similar thoughts, really. I think when you got the most successful driver in F1 history going to the most successful constructor, I think it just gives us so much to talk about. I think just seeing Lewis drive Ferrari, just the combination of, the 7-time world champion driving a scarlet red Ferrari, is just going to be so exciting. Yeah, I think it's needed. I think Hamilton needed that refresh, and I think just for the sport having that big move, I think it's been a while since we've had a driver make that sort of big move. All the main protagonists, Verstappen, Leclerc, have all signed long-term deals, so Hamilton moving really just gave us something to work with in terms of the driver market, and obviously set off a chain reaction, so to speak. So yeah, it's great for F1, and in terms of our coverage, it's something that's going to dominate the whole year. If it goes well, it'll probably be even better for us. If it goes badly, then I think there's still a lot to talk about, and a lot of pundits will have a lot to say.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's been one of those things where opinions have really been split, right? Because as you said, he is Lewis Hamilton's most successful driver of all time, also the most expensive driver from a sort of sponsorship, a salary point of view. So it's a big risk from Ferrari, who are also using a lot of that budget on Charles, to then have two leading drivers. Although, of course, throughout last year, one of the storylines within Ferrari was that they had a very fast Carlos Sainz and a very fast Charles Leclerc. And of course, throughout that too, they were involved by the end of the year in a tight Constructors' Championship battle. So kind of extrapolating that logic, you would hope they'll be in that championship fight next year with two strong drivers as well. Do you think the expectation will be for them to be right at the front from the start? I mean, we saw a Ferrari 1-2 in Australia last year. That's the opening race for us this year. The expectation will be from Ferrari's management, from the fans, and probably from Lewis himself, top three, if not winning the first races.
It's going to be interesting to see. Obviously, it looks like it's going to be an incredibly exciting season based on how last year ended. We obviously had sort of 3 or 4 teams really in the hunt for victories every weekend. Assuming that follows into 2025, which it should, you're going to have McLaren, Ferrari, possibly Red Bull. They should be up there too. You're going to have at least 3 teams, potentially Mercedes as well, sort of all fighting it out for victories early on. So it's hard to say that Ferrari will be winning from the off, but clearly the expectation at Ferrari will be to, having narrowly missed out on the constructors title last season, the expectation will absolutely be to be in the championship fight in both world championships. And yeah, it's interesting starting the season in Australia. Ferrari have traditionally done quite well in Australia, and I think back to previous years when it was the season opener and we'd often have Sebastian winning for Ferrari in the first race, and then there'd be all this hype and expectation that it was all, Ferrari are back, they're going to be in title contention again. And obviously it never quite ended up being the case, but I think that's true again this year. And obviously Lewis Hamilton specifically has a particularly good record in Australia. It's one of his strongest circuits. He's got the most pole positions there. So yeah, it's quite an exciting start to the season, and to see how that combination will work. And whether Hamilton will be able to get up to speed straight away, that's probably the biggest question mark. How long it will take him to adapt to the new car. That there's always a process there, but on paper it's a strong circuit for Ferrari and for him historically. So they could be right up there from the get go. And yeah, they've had a fast car last season. They were contending for poles and victories. So I don't see why that can't be the case sort of at the start of the year.
Yeah, I think a crucial point for Ferrari last year was that their in-season development seemed to actually, they overcame their difficulties. So I think the upgrade in Barcelona was really put them on the back foot. I think they dropped to maybe like the third or fourth fastest team. I think Leclerc and Sainz ran different packages at Silverstone due to test the two different packages, and they got over that. They came back with that upgrade for Monza, and they won in Qatar, which was really unexpected, and the end of season form was really strong. So I think they have proven that they can improve the car, which I think in the Sebastian Vettel years against Hamilton, they just always seem to get worse throughout the season. So I think there's a lot of good signs with Ferrari. So I think when you sign Hamilton, you have to challenge for the title. I mean, I think a title-winning car will give Hamilton that motivation as well. So I think all the signs are looking good for Ferrari, but I do think McLaren probably have a little bit of edge when it comes to the car. And you can't rule out Red Bull and Max Verstappen, of course.
Absolutely.
I do think, just to jump in and add to that, I do think obviously signing Hamilton, I think that only strengthens Ferrari's driver lineup. Obviously they had a very strong driver lineup with Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc, and I think that worked very well as a dynamic. And it'll be interesting obviously to see how that changes when Hamilton comes in and how that dynamic will work alongside Leclerc. But I think fundamentally they have an even stronger driver lineup now. I struggle to see how that can be argued against when you look at the statistics on paper and everything. Yeah, so I think in sort of on paper at least, they're in a strong position at the start of this year from that perspective.
Yeah, I
For
think
sure. When you talk about the additions to Ferrari, right, a lot of that is of course driven by their new team principal, and we've got another new team principal coming in this year. But Fred Vasseur seems to have kind of massively changed the perspective from which Ferrari is reported on, right? Because throughout those Vettel years with Kimi and the early ones with Charles too, it's exactly like you said, to where they would be close to winning, but then they'd have a bad pit stop or a strategy error or little kind of mistakes that become so kind of idiosyncratically Ferrari that it became a kind of self-reinforcing thing where we would talk about them getting right up to it and then bottling it at the end or making kind of obvious mistakes, like not having the tyres out in time. And we see Vasseur kind of making these slow kind of small changes and then adding on top of that a massive signing like Lewis. One of the things I did want to talk about too with this move is that of course Lewis is leaving Bono at Mercedes and will be working with a new race engineer and kind of adapting to a Ferrari style of working. And you would have to think it's something that came up in the negotiations, that he's going to want all these different kind of needs met and his style of communication. Do you think that they'll be, I suppose, treated like equally in their kind of debriefs and strategy and things? Because of course both driver always wants either the first pit stop, they want to be on the two stopper if they think that's faster, they want a kind of rear gunner system there. Is that a dilemma for Ferrari to kind of balance having two strong drivers, or do you think the experience with Sainz and Leclerc in a similar situation will give them a structure they can work with?
Yeah, I think, like you say, the experience with Sainz will give them a good template to work with. I do think the key point is Leclerc. I do think Leclerc's not really an abrasive character. If you think of, let's say, Hamilton's teammates Rosberg and Alonso, when you think of how they are, how they can act, I do think Leclerc is one of those drivers who leaves it on the track, but off track he's just like a nice guy. You could argue he's maybe too nice sometimes, but I do think that will work well with Ferrari. Leclerc respects Ferrari, he's always behind the team, so I think that will work well. And like you said, I think Fred Vassell's really brought a calmness, a stability to the team. I think with Riva Bene in the Vettel Izzy Bonotto, it was just complete chaos and strategy, team orders, everything just seemed to go wrong, and it was just a major talking point week in, week out. So, like, I think, I don't think there'll be any issues with Hamilton and Leclerc. To be honest, like I said, I think Hamilton with Rosberg, Alonso was always going to cause some issues. I think Leclerc as a character should complement Hamilton really well.
I agree, and I also think they'll start the season on equal footing. I mean, Hamilton hasn't previously asked for, he's never demanded number one status within the team, and I believe that's the case again going to Ferrari. And Ferrari have traditionally had that mindset of both drivers are on an equal footing until one is in a position to potentially win the championship, and then that's when they'll consider any sort of team orders or favouring one driver or anything. So I don't think that'll be an issue early on. I think, they'll both start off with sort of equal treatment. But I agree with Vasseur coming in. He's really sort of, I think, stabilised Ferrari. I wouldn't say there's been any sort of headline changes necessarily that you can think of that have made a huge difference, but he's clearly behind the scenes been working very hard on the organisational structure, and we're seeing less mistakes and strategic errors, and just everything seems to be falling into place for Ferrari now. It's been very calm, just very stable, and I think perhaps Hamilton coming in is that now the missing piece that Ferrari potentially needed to sort of take that next step to finally start winning some titles again after a long drought.
Yeah, and you mentioned that kind of stability too. When we look at who Ferrari are potentially going to be fighting for that title this year, Red Bull and Mercedes have both got new young drivers kind of coming in, which maybe in a kind of driver's title context might actually help Russell and Verstappen, thinking that they have a kind of natural first status. But from a Constructors' Championship perspective, we saw with Red Bull last year what can happen when that gap between your first and second driver grows too large. And the two contenders for the title last year were McLaren and Ferrari, of course. With McLaren winning it, they are keeping both of their drivers who were very strong throughout all of last year at McLaren. And I think a lot of the expectation is maybe not in the British press, but the international press, the expectation is that Oscar is not going to be wanting to get into those debates about moving out of the way for Lando, about helping Lando in his title fight. He did that for a reasonable percentage of last year, and we spent a lot of time talking about, are they actually going to follow team orders? There was a time where they denied having them, then they accepted that they were having them, then they sort of didn't, and Oscar said he didn't quite agree with the messaging from the team there. Do you think that McLaren are, of course, reigning Constructors' Champions, they're the natural leaders, the front runners when we talk about, rivals for Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc?
I think they have to be. I think
I'd say so.
Yeah, I think they've just got a nice balanced pairing. I think Lando, despite a lot of the criticism he did receive, I think the actual performance and pace he showed was like at a World Championship winning level. I do think there were a number of areas maybe that did creep in at the start of the season, but I think by the end of the year you can't really criticise him too much. He had Oscar Piastri at arm's length, so I do think McLaren, on top of the fact I think their car is probably the most balanced across a variety of circuits. The Ferrari was better, let's say, longer straights, 90-degree corners. The McLaren high speed was generally had a bit of an advantage, so I do think McLaren probably do have the edge. I think McLaren and Ferrari is probably, you can't look past that because they're the two driver pairings, and like you say, the rookies, we just don't know how they're going to perform.
Yeah, I echo a lot of Connor's thoughts there. I think McLaren have to go into the season as sort of the early favourites at least, just based on how they sort of ended the second half of last year with the fastest car. They've got a very strong driver pairing that showed they worked well together, even in the sort of team orders and championship kerfuffle at times. They still came out on top, and I think for that reason they have to kind of go into the year as favourites. But go back to my previous point I made earlier about Ferrari being in a strong position now. I think that's one of the key things is the driver lineups, and McLaren have got an incredibly strong driver lineup, and I think Ferrari already had that. I think it's now stronger again. And then you look at Red Bull and Mercedes, and there's question marks. There's a bit of an unknown into how Liam Lawson in particular will perform, and Kimi Antonelli as well. He's obviously proven to be very quick, but I think Mercedes have said themselves that they expect him to make quite a lot of mistakes this year. And I think Toto said in Abu Dhabi that they expect to be tearing their hair out quite a lot with Kimi this year. But on the flip side, they expect when he gets it right, it will be pretty special too. But I think when you consider all of that, I think McLaren and Ferrari definitely are probably in that stronger position in terms of the driver lineup anyway, and therefore over the course of a season, you'd have to say that they are probably the two teams most likely to challenge for the constructors, also based on their car performance going, at the back end of last season as well.
Yeah, I'm interested. You mentioned Antonelli there, right? As a sort of contrast to Liam Lawson, he's done the DTM before. He's had a full Super Formula season. He's had a reasonable amount of races, both of course last year covering for Ricciardo and coming in, 2 years ago covering for Ricciardo and then coming in this year as well. With Antonelli, he's coming in never having done a race before to a factory Mercedes seat as the Mercedes sponsored driver. George Russell had years and years at Williams to prepare for that, and we still saw a kind of element of like teething problems coming in when that promotion came through. I suppose I'm interested, how you think Antonelli will be able to handle that. I have in my head the lap in Monza, right, in practice, where everyone was, while he was going around thinking, oh my god, he's purple, he's pushing like crazy, and I feel like that could almost be a representation of what we'll see throughout this year, where he does have that potential, but almost a bit like Colapinto too, he has that ability to push the car, that confidence, that kind of natural speed, but it's so easy to lose these cars, right? They're so powerful, and they'll go in an instant. I'm interested how you think Antonelli will be able to handle that, and then you add on the natural pressure of just wanting to perform for the team, and all the cameras that are going to be on him from Sky and Mercedes and all the press thinking, have they made the right decision? I suppose my question is, what do you think is a realistic goal for Antonelli this year? What will be a sign that Mercedes were right to put their faith in him?
I think that's hard to say at this stage when obviously we don't quite know where Mercedes are gonna rack up in the pecking order. And the last few years they've been neither here nor there for large quantities of the season. They've not shown any signs of being able to string together a sort of a championship campaign. They've sort of had these flashes of performance where, like we saw in Vegas last year, where they obviously ended up with a 1-2. It could have been even more dominant than that, but they didn't seem to have any sort of explanation for how they achieved that performance. And then there are other weekends when they're absolutely nowhere and back in sort of 4th or 5th. So if that sort of continues into 2025, and sort of anticipate that it will, at least early on, I think it's quite difficult to sort of have a set goal for Antonelli. And I'm not sure, based on everything that we've heard from Toto Wolff so far as well, I don't think they will be setting him specific goals to achieve it in that sense. He's been very keen to sort of downplay all the hype around Antonelli and sort of keep everything on a low. So yeah, I'm not sure there will be specific goals, if that makes sense. It's hard to know whether Mercedes will be in contention. Sure, Kimi will obviously want to be getting podiums and wins and challenging for pole positions. That's natural, as will George Russell as well. But I'm not sure there will be necessarily a specific target set for him. And while there is an element of him being under pressure, I think he's also he's got to be given a bit of breathing space initially. Mercedes know what they're doing with him. They're bringing in, again, Toto's been very clear that to sort of lower those expectations, to bring in an 18-year-old who has potentially a massive future in the sport. They see him as their sort of answer to Max Verstappen. That's why they were so keen to give him that race seat. They're not going to, I just don't see that they're just going to then chuck him out if has a bit of a slow start or not quite meeting those standards that maybe everyone expects. I think Mercedes would be quite happy maybe if he goes under the radar a little bit, but isn't crashing the car every weekend, rather than maybe pulling out these exceptional performances. I think those will potentially come in time. yeah, I think it's hard to say at this stage. I think.
Yeah, no, I can't disagree too much. I think 2025 probably is a good year for Antonelli to join the team because realistically, based on the last 3 years, you can't really expect Mercedes to be in title contention realistically. I think 2026 is the big year. I think Toto Wolff has already spoken about how the feeling inside the team is really, it's a good feeling ahead of the new engines. So I think it's going to be a year of learning for Antonelli. But I think for me, seeing like a rookie come into the sport, I think we need to see Antonelli's raw pace. We need to see if he's actually got it, because I think when it comes to time management and things like that, you can improve on that. We saw with Leclerc in his first year of Ferrari, he was rapid against Vettel, but it was the second year where it's time management and all these other areas he really improved. So I think, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how he does, but yeah, who knows.
It's a good year for him to. It's a good year for him to bed in before obviously the regulations come in and change again next year. Mercedes wouldn't have wanted to stick him in the car for the first time next season when they potentially, could be in a championship winning position. It's better to have this year now, like as Connor said, to learn, to make mistakes and to grow from that as a driver. And yeah, if he has the 1 lap pace and fundamentally has the speed, everything else can be improved on. We've seen it as well with the likes of Piastri too. He's was undoubtedly quick from the off in 2023 and last season as well. And there have been areas that he's improved on too, with his consistency, his tyre management, aspects like that. And I think it'll be a similar case for Antonelli too. I think it's ideal in a way for Mercedes to bring him in now and have this year with less pressure, less expectation. There's still pressure, of course there is. Performance is everything in F1, but Mercedes are playing the long game here with Antonelli. He is seen as their future, and yeah, this will be a learning year and the chance to make those mistakes before they're then in that championship winning position when obviously expectations will be very different.
Yeah, for sure. So I was literally just before that about to say it reminds me exactly of Piastri, because when we talk about a kind of model for the best rookie who's come into the sport in recent memory and had that kind of learning curve between raw pace and then learning strategy, time management, effectively patience, right, throughout the race distance to know what's my fastest lap time versus what's my fastest possible time over 50 laps or 60 laps, depending on where you are. You talked about rookies being under pressure there. One of the fastest ways to put your new rookie driver under pressure is to sign one of the best rookie drivers from last year as your reserve driver, which is exactly what Flavio Briatore and Alpine have done. With Jack Doohan, of course, we saw him have effectively a test run in Abu Dhabi, but he's a rookie along the likes of the other ones that are joining, and he'll know that actually someone who's already raced in Formula One, already impressed a lot of teams, including Red Bull, who considered him, I think, for a minute before. How does Doohan approach then coming in this year and starting at a home race too, right? There'll be a lot of Australian media there watching him. There'll be questions from our press. I'm sure Laura, our social media editor, will be more qualified to talk about it. But anytime you mention anything about Williams now, Alpine now, on social media, the waves of Argentinians in the comments backing Colapinto, saying move him in. There's this immense kind of movement of all these different factors that seem to be naturally pushing Colapinto towards that seat, and in turn pushing against Doohan, who was reserve driver for a long time. We saw him, fans of the F1 TV broadcast. He was a great pundit on there. I suppose my question is, like, how do you think he's doing? Just sort of like feeling about that at the moment, and do you think their treatment of him has been fair to kind of make that move?
How is Doohan doing?
I don't. I wouldn't say it's fair per se, but Formula One isn't fair. I think Valtteri Bottas had a very strong season. I know he didn't score any points, but he had a great year in the worst car on the grid, and he's been dropped. So I don't think F1 is really fair like that. But to be honest, I think in terms of Doohan, I was very surprised he even got the seat in the first place. I don't think his Schooner record was that stellar. I don't think Alpine sort of rushed into it when they didn't need to. He was already on their books. So I think it is harsh, but I think it's just inevitable. I think Doohan is, to be blunt, a dead man walking, really. I think he'll last 4, 5, 6 races at best. I do think, against Gasly, he's probably one of the best midfield drivers on the grid. He's going to have a really tough time. And I think when you get Colapinto out of his contracts from Williams and the money they reportedly had to pay for him, you don't just see him on the sidelines for the whole season, especially when you've got all those Argentinian fans, the sponsorship money. Briatore's not afraid to make big decisions when it comes to drivers over the years with Renault and Benetton. He doesn't really care. So, unfortunately for Doohan, it is harsh, but I think it's inevitable that at some stage we will see Colapinto in the middle part of the year.
It does feel inevitable already, just with the way that this has been sort of panning out in recent weeks. And it is absolutely harsh and unfair on Jack. But I also think that, I'm actually not sure why Alpine made the decision to promote Jack this season as early as they did. I think it was announced back in July or August, and at that time, the driver market was still moving. And when you've got Jack on a contract as your reserve driver, he wasn't going anywhere else. I struggle to see sort of Alpine's logic to make that call so early when there was still a large portion of the season to go. And as we saw in the end, Checo lost his seat at Red Bull and things happened towards the end of the year that we didn't expect. Franco Colapinto coming in as well at Williams. And I just think that they shot themselves in the foot when they didn't need to a certain extent, because they create this dilemma themselves by going so early on a driver that would have been free to them. They could have waited until even the end of the year and seen the pool of drivers that they might have had available to them. Even somebody like Valtteri Bottas, for example, would have absolutely been a stronger option for next year than Jack Doohan. But instead they made that call early, and now it's looking like they're probably going to replace him with a guy they could have signed had they just waited a few months anyway and avoided this whole sort of messy situation. But yeah, he's under huge pressure already. I mean, he was under pressure in Abu Dhabi before. There were already rumours circulating leading up to the race in Abu Dhabi that Franco Colapinto had been having chats with Alpine, and the first sort of murmurs of a possible switch to Alpine were happening before the last race of the season, which Doohan was sort of drafted in for an early debut. There was already talk around his future then, and he hadn't even driven a race. Yeah, it's there's huge pressure on him, and it does just feel inevitable that, I think, like Connor said, you're looking at a handful of races. He's said to be on a Jack Doohan, he's said to be on a short-term contract anyway with Alpine, potentially only for a handful of races. So they have that option open to them, which this all sort of aligns with everything that's been going on behind the scenes with them bringing in Colapinto in the first place. It just feels inevitable that, unfortunately for Jack, he's probably going to get spat out before he's really had a proper chance to prove his worth. But that is also the sort of the nature of the beast that is F1. And yeah, particularly as Connor mentioned with Flavio Briatore as well, we know he's not afraid to make these hard decisions. And he's sort of already insinuated that that there can't be any room for sort of sentiment with these when it comes down to performance at the end of the day.
And he's also accidentally leaked his team's livery on his Instagram, right? I saw you guys covering that. I wanted to touch on a team that is maybe not making the headlines so much, although you mentioned Bottas before, but a team that has two new drivers coming in and a new team principal. And of course, you touched on the management abilities of Mattia Binotto, although not maybe in a positive light earlier in the podcast. But Sauber, Bortoletto coming in as Formula 2 champion, a strong Formula 2 champion in a very competitive year for Formula 2, where you had Behrman driving, you had Antonelli driving, you had Hadjar driving. It was a really strong field. Bortoletto came out on top of that and is getting promoted then to the team that came out on the bottom of Formula 1 last year. He'll have Nico Hülkenberg to learn from, who's a really solid driver, good at qualifying, good at races, experienced, has driven a lot of cars throughout Formula 1, knows how a good team should work. Similarly with Jonathan Wheatley, right, massively experienced, has been, helped build Red Bull from the ground up, and is being asked to do effectively the same thing at Sauber. Of course, it's pretty much the hardest thing to do in the sport, to build a team from the back of the grid to the front. For Bortoletto specifically, do you think he'll be expecting to kind of match Hülkenberg, or is he going to be focused on a kind of development year, because you would imagine he's under slightly less pressure than Doohan or the rookies that are kind of moving forward to the front teams.
Yeah, I think there's maybe similar to Kimi Antonelli's situation as well. There's got to be that element of giving the rookie drivers a bit of time to sort of adapt. And as we know, Nico Hülkenberg is no slouch. He's an incredibly capable, solid point scorer, and he was fantastic at times last season for Haas, particularly over one lap, and then converting those qualifying performances into points. So he's got a really tough test as his teammate for a start, but the tougher test is probably the car that he's going to be driving, which, as we saw last season, Sauber pretty much had the slowest car on the grid at the end of the year, and clearly their focus is on 2026, the new regulations, Audi coming on board and fully taking over the team. And there's very much a long-term project there. And I think this season we can probably expect more of the same for Sauber. It's going to be a tough year for them. They're going to be running probably towards the back of the field. Their focus is going to be on 2026 rather than they know they won't be able to make those kind of huge gains and steps to move forward this year. So I just, from the budget financial point of view, that it doesn't make much sense to pile everything into this year when we've got a new set of regulations. It's a clean slate, and there's the opportunity there next season to make some big potential leap forward. So I think that'll be where the focus is, and therefore for Bortoletto, I don't think there will be too much pressure on him, because it is, again, a learning year development. There's obviously Sauber will be able to have a good yardstick for him with Hülkenberg alongside him and be able to see how he matches against Hülkenberg, which at the end of the day, it's a cliche, but the only person you can really sort of be tested against is your teammate in F1 at the end of the day, especially when you're in a car that's not competitive and towards the back of the field. That's really the only sort of thing they can base his performances off. So they'll get a good feel for that. But otherwise, I mean, they're not going to be expecting to, based on how the end of last season went, they're not going to be expecting to be challenging for points every weekend. So naturally, there's less pressure on his shoulders. But he's still got a tough job on his hands. Arguably, in some ways, it's trickier for him because there's less opportunity to stand out and shine. Unlike people like Franco Colapinto, for example, where the Williams is just that little bit faster, and particularly over one lap at certain circuits as well, has been able to get into Q3 and been in a position to challenge for points. It's harder for a driver who's potentially going to be battling around for places outside of the top 10, and on paper we're looking at that and seeing it as there's no headline grabbing story from that, but he could still be putting in a very strong drive in that race, and it gets overlooked because the sort of headline result isn't there. So it'll be quite hard for him to sort of stand out.
Okay, so we've worked our way kind of around the grid. It's the start of the year, so it's important that we make some bold, completely unfounded predictions on what we think is going to happen. We started the episode by talking about Lewis and Ferrari. Within that teammate battle, do you guys have a strong view of Leclerc's going to have him, or Hamilton will cause the upset?
Yeah, I think it's hard to look past Leclerc at the minute, to be honest. I think if you look at 2024 against Russell, I think Leclerc is a little bit better all-round as a driver than Russell. Of course, I think Hamilton will take a step forward with Ferrari. I just think it's inevitable. Fresh environment, probably a better handling, more stable car, but I think Leclerc is, in my opinion, probably the second best driver on the grid after Verstappen. So even if it was a peak Lewis Hamilton joining Ferrari, I think he'd still have a difficult task going against Leclerc. So it all comes down to whether Hamilton can really make that step forward in qualifying. I think Leclerc is widely regarded as the fastest driver over one lap, especially when he gets it together anyway. So if Hamilton is qualifying 8th, 7th, and Leclerc's 3rd or 2nd, he's got no chance, to be honest, especially because the grid will be closer. The dirty air is expected to be even worse, so making those recovery drives is going to be even more difficult. So I think if you look at the facts, it's hard to look past Leclerc, but it is Lewis Hamilton we're talking about, so it's foolish to rule them out. So, but yeah, I think I can't look past Leclerc right now.
I think that's the biggest question mark, is how Lewis performs in qualifying and whether he can get over that sort of slump that he's suffered the last few years at Mercedes against Russell, and whether the Ferrari car might suit him better. That might help there's been a lot of talk about that. We're just not going to know until we obviously get into the season. But it is going to be a huge challenge for Hamilton because, as Connor mentioned, Charles is regarded as one of, if not the fastest over a single lap. So that naturally, given the struggles Lewis had, particularly last season against George Russell, who also is incredibly quick over one lap, I think that's probably going to be the biggest test for Hamilton this year, is how he fares against Charles in qualifying. And I would, at this stage, I'd expect Charles to out-qualify Hamilton, possibly over the course of the season, certainly early on as well, while Hamilton's sort of bedding in. I think, as Connor sort of alluded to there, I think the biggest sort of challenge for Hamilton is not to have those, with the field as tight as it is, to have those gaps in terms of position that he did to Russell last season. I think if you've got Charles potentially on pole position with Lewis alongside, I think Hamilton would finish ahead in the race, as we've seen, like, still to this day, that Hamilton's biggest strength is his performances on Sunday, even if he's possibly lost a bit of his qualifying speed, a bit of edge there. So I think, like, if they're close together on the track, 1 or 2 positions apart, I think Hamilton can have the edge in over races and win more races. While we've seen some big improvements from Charles, I think that was early on in his sort of Ferrari career. There was some question marks over that side of things. He'd be rapid in qualifying, get pole, but not be able to convert that into a win, whether that be through making errors, which he's largely cut out now. We're seeing less mistakes from him, particularly in race scenarios, but he's also just a far more consistent driver. And as we saw with his victories last season, in Monaco, Monza and Austin, particularly Monza was particularly impressive as well, how he was able to manage that race and pull that victory off. So he's definitely made improvements there, but I still think Hamilton is the stronger of the 2 drivers over a race distance. And as I said, I think the biggest question is really how he performs in qualifying and whether he can sort of recover from that slump. And I think it will be, I know, a lot of people have been saying, well, he's lost an edge, he's maybe over the peak. And I think this year will give us a fairer reflection of where Hamilton really is in terms of his peak performance, particularly over qualifying, which has obviously been a weakness generally since with this generation of car, but particularly last season. I think will be a fairer test in a different car against a different teammate, to see how, if that trend continues, then maybe there's a case there that he perhaps is, whether he's lost some natural raw pace, or whether it's the car specifically, and this sort of generation that he's struggling with. But yeah, I think we'll get a truer answer this year of where he really stands in terms of his peak performance, and whether or not we're seeing the sort of decline of Lewis Hamilton, or whether he does still have it. I think we'll kind of get probably a better answer this season.
Yeah, and I think there was also, it felt like at Mercedes there was almost a psychological element coming into it last year, where Lewis didn't believe that he had the pace to challenge George, or to challenge like that, and therefore he didn't have the pace, because it became a sort of self-reinforcing thing. But we've seen so much kind of optimism now emerge from Lewis's camp, and of course all of the Ferrari media, and there's so much kind of hype and positivity forming into that movement, that you would hope that will kind of turn that switch in Lewis's head with regards to that kind of self-belief, because he was really, really harsh last year on it. And it was really interesting to kind of read in all the debriefs, right, because he'd started to not be in the technical meetings and all the things like that, and it felt like, Russell was naturally then getting priority, he would get upgrades and things, but Lewis never turned around and said, oh, it's the team. He was always saying, it's my fault, I need to get faster, probably more than any other time in his career, coming out and saying, maybe I have lost it, maybe I, and it was kind of real change in messaging there. So as we're getting to the end of our record here, Connor, I mentioned I wanted bold predictions. Give me 2. Give me winner in Australia, and give me 2025 drivers Formula 1 world champion.
Yeah, so drivers champion, I'm going to go for Norris. I just think that the pace he showed at the end of the year, he really cut out some of those mistakes. I know Brazil was a little bit all over the place in terms of he ran wide a couple of times, but I think some of his performances from pole to taking the win, I just think the pace he has shown is at an incredible level. I think the gap he had to Piastri is a little bit underrated. People going around about Piastri's so close to being, but really, like Piastri, I qualified him probably 4 times last year, so I do think, Norris is the man to beat on top of having probably the fastest car in the McLaren. And the winner for the first race, I'm going to go for Leclerc. I think it'd be a good field story for Ferrari, and hopefully Hamilton's not too far behind.
Well, if we're going to go bold, then I'm going to say Hamilton for. I'm actually going to say Hamilton for both. I'm going to say Hamilton for the win in Australia because he's got an incredible record around Melbourne. Ferrari have historically been competitive there, and like what a story that would be, like to win for Ferrari in his debut and replicate the same feat that the likes of Alonso have achieved for Ferrari too. And obviously that would just spur on this hype train that we're talking about. But also, for the Drivers' Championship again, if we're going bold, I'm going to say Hamilton. I think this is the move that he absolutely needed to sort of rejuvenate himself. I think we saw last season. I think there was an element that he'd probably checked out. It was strange timing with the obviously kind of it made the whole situation odd, didn't it, with knowing before the season had started that he was moving to Ferrari, and then obviously the dynamics of how that played out at Mercedes, and he was obviously getting phased out of meetings as you'd expect, and whether or not Russell ended up getting preferential treatment with setups and stuff, perhaps, we don't know. But I think just this fresh start is what Hamilton needs, and he's still shown enough for me that the moments last season, that there were definitely times he wasn't on top of his game, and he had some pretty poor weekends by his standards. Obviously, it was one of his worst seasons in F1 statistically, but there was still those moments where when there's a sniff of a win, he absolutely takes it. I mean, I think about Silverstone and to a slightly lesser extent Spa, because obviously he won that as a result of Russell being disqualified, but he was also leading a large chunk of that race, and it kind of came down to strategy that put Russell ahead of him on track. But I just think that, sort of seeing those moments of when there is a sniff of a win, he's still able to extract those performances. Whether he can do it over the course of a full season remains to be seen, but I'm going with that as my prediction. So Hamilton for the winner in Australia and to win the championship, which would be an incredible story to break, obviously, Michael Schumacher's record of 7 world titles that he currently jointly holds, and to end Ferrari's title drought. Be a pretty amazing story.
Yeah, I like it. I mean, I think, there's that statistic where like Leclerc has more poles than wins. I wonder if there's a statistic where Ferrari has far more pundit predicted championships than actual ones, because I feel like every year they come in and
they must
it's
do.
Almost, it's almost romantic that it would be, like you said, such a drought. It's the perfect storyline. They were, as close as they were in, I guess, 17 and 18 last year, if not closer, to having the fastest car. I've written down and then crossed out a bunch of predictions in my notebook, because I feel like every one I write down I can come up for a counter argument with. I like the idea of Piastri winning in Australia. I'm sorry, I'm gonna get some beef with you here, Connor, for it. But the idea of, well, we mentioned earlier from a technical standpoint, the high-speed corners in Australia with the changes they've made to their circuit. If we can kind of, when you use a fancy word I used earlier, extrapolate that line of, McLaren's car working well in those corners, it's a nice kind of jigsaw fit for that circuit, I think. Although, for the story, I'm going to go with you, Lewis. Go with you, Lewis, and you, Lewis, on the call. But partially heart, partially head, saying that hopefully the championship will be coming back to. I was going to say back to England. He lives in Monaco, right? Back to Monaco, where I imagine it heads pretty much every year, and to Maranello. I suppose what I did, one more thing I did want to mention, and this is just maybe not a conspiracy theory as much as an idea, but when we look back to Lewis's move from McLaren to Mercedes, at the time it was much more criticised than the move he's making now, where everyone is kind of lauding this expectation on. When he went to Mercedes, everyone thought, why would you move from a team like McLaren to a team kind of midfielders like Mercedes? But what Lewis obviously knew at the time was that as part of convincing him to go for that move, they had kind of said, we have a solution for our powertrain for the hybrid regulations, right? They knew, not presented to the public, but sort of shown to him that there was this solution, and kind of with the backing of Lauda, right? There is alongside, of course, the the salary package that they offered him. I wonder if they hadn't kind of also presented their 25 car and also maybe their 26 car to Lewis to say, here's what we think we'll be fighting at the front next year, and whether that was part of the convincing element for him. Of course, he would have also seen what Mercedes had with some lead time there, of course, but he would have seen what Mercedes had coming up in the pipeline and been able to compare that to what Ferrari had shown him. Do you think that, first of all, of course, the expectation is for Lewis to stay at Ferrari to 26 too, right? I mean, it's up to him. No one knows exactly what he's going to do. But is that a relationship you see continuing into the next regulation cycle?
Yeah, I think it probably is, because I think there was a lot of talk about Hamilton actually not getting offered an ambassadorial role. I don't think he felt loved by Mercedes in some sense. He felt like he wasn't listened to in terms of feedback as well. So I think all these factors probably played a big part, rather than, I think everyone expects Mercedes to be quick in 2026 in terms of the power unit. So I do think it was the bigger picture, fulfilling that childhood dream of racing for Ferrari, that long-term maybe ambassadorial role as well. I think Giancarlo Fisichella is still part of Ferrari, and he was there in 2009. So I think there is potential for Hamilton to be there for as long as he wants, or in terms of other projects, sort of fashion or whatever you want to do. So yeah, I think it is the complete package. The big paycheck, of course, but I think he just wants to feel loved and respected, and that new lease of life as well. So
yeah, I think there's an element of that as well. I think a lot of this is just fulfilling that dream of driving for Ferrari, which is, again, cliche, but that's what every F1 driver says, that they dream of driving for Ferrari one day. And I think that's true. While Hamilton's never really publicly admitted that, of course he wouldn't when he's been at Mercedes for so long with the loyalty and everything. It would have been a dream for him. And that lure of driving for Ferrari and potentially winning world titles, ending that drought, all of that side of it, I think, is a bigger pull factor for him than necessarily being told that, look, in 2026 we're going to have the best car, which is hard to come out and say. But Ferrari also have produced very good power units in the previous regulations, so I don't think there's any necessary concerns there or anything like that. I think they should have a strong foundation, and performance will come as a result of that. But I think this is more about Hamilton having a fresh start, and let's not forget that I think if the question is can we see Hamilton staying at Ferrari for a long time, then I think yes, because ultimately what swayed his decision was we can say performance at Mercedes. He's obviously had the last 3 years proving that they haven't been able to get their heads around this current generation of car, and they've not been able to, we've not seen anything from Mercedes that suggests they've got an answer for the competitiveness that they've been lacking. Obviously 26 will be a refresh, but on top of that, they weren't willing to give him that long-term contract, and Ferrari have basically said, we'll give you whatever you want. So I think there's an element of that sort of stability side of it as well. Lewis knows, like Hamilton would have known that at Mercedes, the long-term aim would be to bring in Antonelli into the team. And maybe I think that probably did have a factor in the decision, as well as the performance side of it. Whereas at Ferrari, he's got that contract that he wants. And ultimately, if he might decide. I personally can't see him quitting before the end of his contract that he's signed, that we believe is at least till the end of 26. I just don't see why he'd make that move and quit. I think the only scenario that he maybe would quit is if he won the championship and then decided to retire as an 8-time world champion. Even in that case, I'm not sure he necessarily would, especially with the unknown of going to the 26 rules. I think he's in it with Ferrari for the long haul. And even if it doesn't go well, even if if they're not fighting for the championship next season or the year after, I don't see him making such a huge move to then walk away after a season or two. I think a lot of it is that sort of stability, and I think Connor's right as well. The feeling loved and appreciated by the team. I think Hamilton thrives off that, and you often get his best performances when he's got that feeling, which he had for so long at Mercedes. And I think it's just time for something new for him and that fresh start.
Everyone is a Ferrari fan, even if they say they're not a Ferrari fan. They are a Ferrari fan. That's why I've got Ring in my head, and hopefully he'll be closer than Sebastian Vettel was to both of those titles. Well, I'm conscious of time here, guys, and I'd like to say to you both, thank you very much for joining me on the inaugural episode of the Crash F1 2025 podcast. Thank you to you for watching and listening. Make sure to subscribe on YouTube to hear more from us. Give us a 5-star review on any podcast platform of your choice, and let us know down in the comments what you want to hear about on our next episode as we get ever closer to testing in Bahrain and the fall of the green flag in Melbourne. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you very much.